We begin my top 30 remaining quarterback rankings. Players who played on Thursday night, such as Brock Purdy and Matt Stafford, are not included in these rankings as they've already played. We begin with quarterbacks that I think are mid to high in QB3s. We have Jake Haener, Tommy DeVito, Desmond Ridder, and Kirk Cousins. So Jake Haener has seen some play this year in splotches. He's thrown one total touchdown to no interceptions. I just think that there really isn't much upside with the practice squad level receivers that he's throwing to. He still has Jawan Johnson and Alvin Kamara, but that's really it. I think the upside is incredibly limited, and if I could start any other quarterback in the entire NFL this week that's playing, I would. Tommy DeVito scored 10 points in his only start this season. We did see last year he had some rushing upside. While Baltimore is definitely a matchup that most quarterbacks should be able to exploit, I still think he's going to have a pretty tough time. And if I could start anybody besides Jake Haener at QB, I would. Desmond Ridder is playing against Atlanta this week, so I do think he's going to end up throwing a touchdown to Brock Bowers, but I think basically the entirety of his production is going to be Bowers and Jacoby Myers. I do think he has a multi-turnover game, and so I would absolutely try to avoid him, but he does have rushing upside, and I would prefer him to DeVito or Haener. Kirko Chains has been terrible recently. He's had 0 touchdowns and at least 1 interception in each of the past 4 games in which he's played. Las Vegas is definitely the matchup for him to exploit. I do think he's going to get sacked by Max Crosby probably at least 2 times in this game, but I do think he ends up throwing a touchdown to Pitts and breaks his streak of 4 straight games without a touchdown. And now we have a clump of quarterbacks that I would consider potentially high-end QB3s to potentially mid QB2s. We have Bryce Young, Mac Jones, Cooper Rush, CJ Stroud, Russ Wilson, Drake May, Will Levis, and Geno Smith. So Bryce Young 2 weeks ago finished as a top 10 quarterback. He had a rushing touchdown, which was most of the reason why. He definitely came back down to earth, but he's thrown at least 1 passing touchdown in each of the past 3 weeks. And so I still think he's a very low ceiling in general, but decent floor quarterback, at least after the benching. There are lots of quarterbacks in which I would rather have, but this is a plus matchup. Mac Jones, after posting a pretty good fantasy performance 2 weeks ago, just like with Bryce Young, came way back down to earth this past week. Here against the Jets, I think he is going to face quite the stingy pass rush, but I think he does end up throwing a touchdown to Brian Thomas Jr., making him a low ceiling but decent floor option if you're really hurting at quarterback. Cooper Rush has thrown at least 2 touchdowns in 2 of the past 3 weeks. Here against the Panthers, I think he's going to have a lot better luck. I don't think he's going to have a massive fantasy performance, but I do think he hits CeeDee Lamb for a touchdown. CJ Stroud has been pretty disappointing. His fall from grace from being a top 3 fantasy pick in startup drafts and Dynasty, at least this past season, definitely hasn't worked out. The offensive line is a big reason why. Here against Miami, it is the second toughest matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. I think it's hard to trust him as more than a low-end QB2. We just haven't seen the upside this season. He's a really good player, but until the situation improves, he's really nothing more than a mid QB2. Russell Wilson, in the past 2 weeks, has thrown 5 touchdowns to just 1 interception. However, here against Philadelphia, he is going to face a nasty pass rush, as well as a really tough secondary. There's a legitimate shot that George Pickens doesn't play, which is going to make his life really difficult if that's the case. It's already going to be difficult even if Pickens does end up playing. So I would really try to avoid starting him if you can, but I would prefer him to some of these other options below him. Drake May, in terms of real-life football, has been playing phenomenally considering his situation. Here against the Arizona Cardinals, though, even though he's had at least 6 straight games of 24-plus rushing yards, I think he's going to have a multi-turnover game, making him a fine QB2, but I don't think he's going to have the upside that he does some weeks. Will Levis, after several straight solid weeks of fantasy performance, definitely came back down to earth this past week with only 7 fantasy points. Here against Cincinnati, it is a great matchup. They do allow the 3rd most points to fantasy quarterbacks. The Titans should be heavy underdogs in this game. I project them to lose, and so I think he's going to see quite a bit of volume in this game, and he's going to be a fine QB2. Geno Smith's schedule has been rough recently. It really doesn't get much easier here against Green Bay. He's a really talented quarterback. He has solid receivers to throw to and a much better offensive scheme than he had with Shane Waldron. I still think, though, that in the matchup against the Green Bay Packers, who allow the 8th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, that if you can, I would sit him, but I still think that he's a solid player and does have some upside, but it is a tough matchup. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid QB2s to potentially high end QB2s. We have A. Rich, Aaron Rodgers, Caleb Williams, Jordan Love, Patrick Mahomes, and Jared Goff. So Anthony Richardson has had 3 touchdowns in the past 3 weeks through the air, and he's also had 3 on the ground in that same time span, along with at least 32 rushing yards. He is very good running the ball. Passing the ball, definitely not the case. Denver is a really tough matchup. They allowed the 7th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. I think he gets it done on the ground, though, and he does have a rushing touchdown. Aaron Rodgers has definitely declined as a fantasy asset and a real-life quarterback. However, against Jacksonville, who allow the 2nd most points to fantasy quarterbacks, I do think he's going to be a solid QB2. I think he throws touchdowns to Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams, and is going to be a solid QB2, but I don't think the massive upside is here this week. Caleb Williams has thrown 7 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 3 weeks. He has only thrown 5 total interceptions on the year, and he's also set the longest streak of pass attempts without an interception for a rookie in NFL history. He also doesn't do anything in the first half of any game he plays, so you're definitely risking it. In a second matchup here against Minnesota, he went off against them in the second half of their first matchup, but in Thomas Brown's first game as the head coach this past week, he didn't do anything once again until the second half, but his passing yards really weren't there. So it is a little bit tricky considering Minnesota is going to face him for the second time, so they may have a better game plan. The upside is absolutely there. He has fantastic players around him. The offensive line is terrible, and he's definitely had stretches of terrible quarterback play, but with him coming off 7 touchdowns to no picks in the past 3 weeks, I still think he's a solid asset for us. I still think he's just a QB2, though, in this matchup, and there is the potential for him to have a terrible week, but I'm still projecting him to have at least a decent second half of this game. Jordan Love has 5 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 3 weeks. He hasn't had one of those massive boom games in a while, but he's also been relatively consistent. Here against the Seattle Seahawks, it's a matchup that should require quite a bit of passing, and so I think he's going to be a fine QB2, but I still think he has a turnover. Patrick Mahomes has thrown 8 touchdowns to just 2 picks in the past 4 weeks. Here against Cleveland, it's a really tough matchup, at least from the pass rush standpoint with Myles Garrett. I think he's going to make Patrick Mahomes' life pretty difficult, and so I think that's going to make Patrick Mahomes more of a QB2 this week. Jared Goff is playing against Buffalo this week. They allow the 4th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, so that's a really tough matchup for him. However, Matthew Stafford just lit them up this past week. I think that Jared Goff is going to have a decent amount of success in this game, but I do think he throws a pick. If you like what you're seeing and hearing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Make sure you check out my wide receiver, running back, and tight end rankings videos as they come out as well. Thanks. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to low in QB1s, but I don't think are likely candidates to be the QB1 this week. We have Sam Darnold, Tua, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, and Jalen Hurts. All right, so with Sam Darnold, he's had 11 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 4 weeks. However, against Chicago, it is a really tough matchup. I do think he has another turnover-free game, but I think his yardage and touchdown totals are going to massively regress from what we saw this past week. Tua, just like Sam Darnold, has thrown 11 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 4 weeks. Here against Houston, I do think it's a bit of a trap game due to their pass rush, though. I still think he's going to have a solid low-end QB1 performance, but I don't think he's going to have another one of these top 5 performances that he's been having the past couple weeks. Justin Herbert has definitely struggled the past couple weeks, especially this past week without Ladd McConkey. Here against Tampa Bay, it is the best matchup for quarterbacks. I think he gets Ladd McConkey back, and I think he's a top 10 option for us once again. Kyler Murray, it's been a minute since he's had a turnover-free massive performance for us. I do think he's going to be a top 10 option. I think he gets 50-plus rushing yards on the ground and a rushing touchdown, which is going to save his day. But I would really like to see some more of the passing upside, especially with them having MHJ and McBride. Baker Mayfield has had an interesting set of games the past couple weeks. He's definitely thrown some touchdowns, but he's also thrown multiple interceptions in the past 2. Here against the Chargers, it's a really tough matchup. They allow the 9th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, but I do think the game script is going to necessitate him throwing quite a bit. I think the Chargers are going to put up some serious points in this game. And so I do think he's going to have a pretty solid day for us in fantasy, but I still think he throws at least one interception. Jalen Hurts is playing against Pittsburgh. They do allow the fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, and so it's a terrible matchup, to be honest with you. He's still an elite quarterback from a fantasy perspective, though. I think he has a rushing touchdown, which is going to salvage his fantasy day. But I would really temper expectations in terms of the upside that he would normally possess. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to elite QB1 options for us this week, and I think are serious threats to be the QB1. We have Jameis, Bo Nix, JD, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen. So Jameis Winston, literally every other game, has either put up a massive performance or a mid to bust week for us in fantasy. I'm obviously kidding in terms of that's why he would be ranked 6. Here against Kansas City, though, it is a better than average matchup, and I do think he's going to have to throw the ball quite a bit to stay in this game. I think he still has a multi-turnover game, but I think the touchdowns will definitely be there. Bo Nix has been a pleasant surprise. Here against Indianapolis, it's definitely a matchup that he should be able to exploit. I think Courtland Sutton has a pretty good game, and for the most part, he's been a really solid option for us at QB. Jaden Daniels, after a blistering start to the season, has really started to turn the ball over recently, but he's still throwing passing touchdowns, and he still scored a rushing touchdown in each of the past 2 weeks. Here against New Orleans, they do allow the 10th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, but I don't think Jaden Daniels really cares. I think he gets a rushing touchdown and is a top 10 option for us. Joe Burrow has thrown 18 touchdowns to just 3 interceptions in the past 5 weeks. Here against Tennessee, it's absolutely a matchup he should be able to exploit. I think Jamar Chase and T. Higgins have very solid days for us in fantasy, and I think Joe Burrow is a top 5 option. Lamar Jackson has only thrown 3 interceptions on the season and has been a top 12 or better option in all but one game for the entire season. Here against the Giants, it's a middle-of-the-road matchup. I don't think they're going to be able to do anything to stop him, and I do think he gets a rushing touchdown. Josh Allen is coming off a 50-point fantasy performance this past week. I definitely don't think that's happening again, but here against Detroit, while it is the 6th toughest matchup you could draw for fantasy production from your quarterback, it's Josh Allen. I think he's going to have to throw the ball quite a bit to stay in this game against Detroit. I think he rushes for multiple touchdowns and is the QB1. And so to review, quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to high in QB3s, we have Haener, DeVito, Ritter, and Cousins. Quarterbacks that I think could be high in QB3s to potentially mid QB2s, we have Young, Jones, Rush, Stroud, Wilson, May, Levis, and Smith. Quarterbacks that I think are mid QB2s to potentially high in QB2s, we have A-Rich, A-Rod, Caleb Williams, Jordan Love, Pat Mahomes, and Jared Goff. Quarterbacks that I think are mid to low-end QB1 options, but probably not likely candidates to be the QB1 this week. We have Darnold, Tua, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, and Jalen Hurts. And then quarterbacks that I think are mid to elite QB1s and that are serious threats to be the QB1 this week. We have Winston, Nix, Daniels, Burrow, Jackson, and Allen. All right, you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. Remember that players who played on Thursday night like Brock Purdy or Matt Stafford are not included in these rankings, as these rankings are being released after Thursday. So if you notice they're missing, that's why. And make sure you check out my running backs, wide receivers, and tight end rankings videos as they come out as well. And if you like what you've seen and heard, just like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.